All right, welcome back to the Low Stick Podcast with my co-host Eric Detman. I'm Jason Retz. We are back with you here in January, and if you can tell, my co-host looks like he hasn't showered or he's taking on the views of Portland. Tell us quick what happened out there.
Yeah, Portland doesn't do winter very well. When we were in Boulder, we got a lot of rain and a little bit of snow. That rain turned into freezing rain. I happen to live kind of on top of a hill where when things go wrong, it takes some time to get to me. So we had a pipe burst in my condo unit, and we've been waterless for about 24 hours and not expected to have that get fixed for another 3 days, 4 days.
So,
So.
as he told me as we started, he is in the Wild Wild West right now. It is not a long celebration of his birthday or his Coach of the Year celebration, although they could be all thrown together. Um,
Sure.
we also just got back from Boulder, which was tremendous. Just a great time spending time with other people who are passionate about the same things you're passionate about. I think there's a ton of learning that happens, but really the great thing that happens is getting together and bouncing ideas off of each other and just kind of checking in with our friends that are across the country, meeting new people, and getting to share hugs with people that we talk to on Zoom or on the phone across the country all the time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's Jay does an amazing job, and we'll talk more about the Boulder experience on a different podcast, but he does an amazing job of NXN coaches and people are at the top of their game and people who are brand new and molding them all together and creating an environment where everybody wants to talk and everybody wants to help each other get better. So yeah, just really amazing experience across the board.
And I hope that people have gotten the vibe from this podcast that great coaches in especially the running world, it's not like trying to reach out to LeBron. You can probably get a hold of just about anybody. And going out to Boulder Running Clinic is a great way for you to see that and understand that firsthand, what's going on.
100%. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
All right, so this month we want to dive into some of the trendy training topics that we have kind of heard and researched just a little bit in the last couple of months. But the big red hot topic right now, I would say, is double threshold training that we're going to jump into. So double threshold training, when you hear that word, Eric, what do you think of?
Jakob Ingebrigtsen.
And so we think of people, obviously, that are spending time as professional athletes, have all kinds of time to do whatever it might be. We hear a lot of college programs that are kind of dabbling into it. Some of our friends are dabbling into it a little bit. I wouldn't say that they have jumped in, cannonballed into the experience yet, but I think just dabbling a little bit into what it is. So double threshold is getting that threshold type stimulus twice within a 24-hour period of time. And the reason I say 24-hour period of time is because some of the variations I've heard or we've heard along the way, what Jakob has made popular is doing two stimuluses in the same day. And there's all different types of ways he does it, but essentially kind of a medium effort twice. He has the luxury of being able to check his millimoles of lactate, which most of us have no idea what that even means, right?
Yep.
If you're listening to this podcast, and you're Scott Christensen, you know what that means. But many of us, other of us don't. Or Jeff Messer, he's on it, right?
Yep.
But us, we're just trying to get that medium effort twice a day. So let's look at some of the positives. So what do you partake as potentially some of the positives of a double threshold type workout? Now let's not categorize it as high school kid. Let's look at that professional athlete. What are some of the positives there?
Yeah, I think, when you're looking at this idea of a new training system, one of the big positives is the ability to get in more volume of work over the course of, like you said, a 24-hour period. So it's never going to the well, it's never super taxing, but it's the ability to do, multiple hard efforts over the course of a day. And this isn't something that just came into fruition, in the last year or so. This is something that it's ironically, as a York guy, this was started by a guy named Marius Bakken who ran at York, right? And you look, excuse me, you look back at some of the training logs that he's written over the last however many years, and that was a big part of his training session. But even taking it a step further, right? Like I remember when I was at Oregon and we'd go and do something tempo-y thresholdy in the morning and come back and run something kind of quick in the afternoon, like 300s or 200s. It's not a totally new concept, But the idea of it is interesting because you do have this ability to get, multiple efforts in the same day, similar to a morning run and an afternoon run, but more, I would consider strenuous efforts.
Yeah, and I think what's really become popular now, what Ingebrigtsen has brought to us, or has brought light to, is kind of the precision that people are trying to take as they dial this in. And let's be completely honest, if you're a professional athlete, you can pretty much plan your day around your double runs.
Right.
As you work backwards, it becomes a little more difficult to do, right? So some of the positives there, obviously, the longer time of stimulus we can have, the with the proper amount of rest, we can adapt the body. Now, when we look into it as a negative, and I really think when we think about negatives, we really walk it backwards and think, okay, why the heck wouldn't we necessarily want to just dive right into a double threshold with a high school kid? And as we look at some of the negatives, the first couple things that come off the top of my head is rest, recovery, and fuel, right? Those would be the hardest thing. They've got a scheduled day where if they're going to run in the morning, potentially, assuming we're doing this during this school year, they're going to run in the morning, they're going to go to school, they're going to eat lunch at a scheduled time, then they're going to run in the afternoon, they got to go do homework. Hopefully they're doing some homework, maybe some studying, maybe spending some time with family or friends, going to bed and trying to recycle that again. I think it becomes difficult, the longevity of trying to do it for a high school kid.
Yes, I agree. It's, to all those points, but the most important is the recovery piece. When you're looking at some of these professional athletes that are doing it, right, they're going to go in the morning, they're going to work out, they can nap for a couple of hours, come back and do an afternoon session. I think that's a big component to it. So if you could figure that out, and maybe the summer makes more sense for that type of work, where you have a little bit more of that flexibility, I think that there can be certainly a place for it. But it does make it more challenging, probably as a high school athlete.
So let's talk about some potential variations here, right? Because if you are a professional athlete or elite athlete, you could mix this up. You could do two in one day. You could potentially do a PM and an AM session over the course of 24 hours. I think you could dabble in a lot of different variations of this, but I also think that as high school coaches, we kind of start the training wheels version of this for some of our kids right now. I
Right.
think that if you're throwing in, let's use a good friend of ours, Chris Johnson. They're getting up in the morning, they're going for a lift, and they're going for a short run, followed by training in the evening. I would argue that they're taking the baby step into double threshold,
Mhm.
because those high school students, like we talked about, are not going to be fully recovered to the point where it's going to be just true recovery, true recovery. That time in between is probably going to give them, I mean, we're not measuring blood lactate, but it's going to be not just an easy recovery run.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. Um, as long as those kids are taken care of, obviously the sleep component is important. That's maybe not something you're doing during the day, but taking care of some of those other things with fueling and hydration and stuff like that. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it from that standpoint, but I think that there's a lot of truth to that. And knowing Chris and knowing what they do in the weight room, that is a challenging effort. That is not it's not just picking up a couple dumbbells 5 or 6 times and calling it good. Like those kids are getting after it in the weight room. So yeah, that's an interesting thought that I hadn't considered.
They may not be, maybe not be working the cardiovascular system the way we would expect for a double threshold, but there's definitely a fatigue factor there that is included. The body's recovering from something, and as we recover from something, we have an increased heart rate, right? All these things are going to happen just
Right.
naturally along the way.
Right. What about, different idea? If we're talking about a 24-hour period, right? What if, and I'm just curious of your thoughts around this, we did something at, 2 o'clock when we get out of school on a Wednesday, and we come back and do something at 2 o'clock when we get out of school on a Thursday. Do you think that falls under that same line, or is that too much time, versus like morning and afternoon, or afternoon, go to bed, wake up in the morning and do something?
That's a great question. Now, if I take the science completely out of it and I think about the high school kid's psyche going into it, knowing that they're doing two workouts or workouts back to back days. Some people do a long run and then they'll turn around the next day and do a workout. There's a lot of benefit to that. I think to a high school kid, I really think it could be the training wheels, because there are so many college programs that are jumping right into this. we could just simply be mentally preparing them for what they may be taking on if they choose to run at the next level.
Sure.
Physiologically, I couldn't give you the exact numbers of precision, but I do think that there's got to be some substance there to the improvement, right? You're giving more stimulus in a shorter period of time than you normally would if they're taking care of their bodies. Obviously, they're not going to be 100% recovered. That's the whole idea, right? Like you don't do double threshold because you're 100% recovered from the one before. You do it because you're enough recovered where you can get something out of the next one.
Right. Yeah, 100% agree with that. Um, yeah, I think there is a lot of, potential value in doing something like that. So let me ask you this. If we're going to go that route and we're going to go afternoon, come back, go afternoon, what do we think's the rest period that a kid needs? Because I think, there's programs out there that are workout Friday, long run Saturday, off Sunday, come back and do something hard on Monday. Is that too little time? Is that enough time? Because it's not a really taxing effort. What do you think about that?
Well, I think stimuluses are a big thing there, right? Because if we're talking about potentially a race on Saturday, a day off on Sunday, and then turn around on Monday, that could be too close together, right?
Right.
But if we're looking at an AM race on Saturday and a PM workout on Monday, there could be enough time in between there. I think, if we talk about what I refer to Scott a lot. He speaks, 24 hours is really the only amount of time you're truly going to need for a threshold workout to come back from, right? Why don't we just do thresholds all the time? Well, we just don't get enough volume out of those works, right? So, like, you can't just do thresholds every day. We're not
Right.
suggesting that. But if, like we were talking about, if you're doing a threshold type workout on Saturday and you're turning around on Monday and doing some type of workout, regardless of what the stimulus is, I think you're okay. But if you try to flip flop that and you try to race on Saturday and you try to threshold on Monday, for some of those kids, they probably stayed up late on Saturday night. Who knows what Sunday looked like for them? Maybe they got up early for church after they stayed up, right? They may not be recovered to come back Monday and do something that's more difficult.
Right.
But I think the timing is super important when we're talking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think, it goes back to what we were saying in the beginning with rest and recovery, making sure that we're taking care of that component. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting idea.
So if I'm baby stepping, so let's assume that we have a kid that is going to go into the world of double threshold wherever they're going to, right? We're not going to
Yep.
put any names out there of schools, but if you know somebody's going, what are some of the things that we could do within our program to not compromise what we want to do, but maybe help prepare them a little bit for the next level?
Yeah, that's a good question because I think before you asked that, I was going to ask at what volume are we are we looking at implementing
Yeah.
double threshold, right? Like it doesn't make sense if we've got a kid who's running 30 miles a week to do double threshold. It's just that's the amount of volume that they're going to find from that type of workout is probably the amount of volume they're going to find over the course of the entire week when it comes to workouts. So before I answer that question, let's step back a second. Like, is there a number that we think is an appropriate number for a high school boy and a high school girl, or maybe it doesn't matter whether it's boy or girl, but just a number you should be running X amount of miles to be doing double threshold type work?
So I know I'm probably going to piss somebody off or be way off this, but I truly believe that. I mean, if you're looking at double threshold type efforts and you are, let's say, a high school boy, you're probably running 60 plus miles a week, no matter what, right?
Right.
Now, I would also say the same thing if you're considering throwing doubles in, just easy doubles. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I think that you need to be over that 40 number before you start considering throwing doubles into kids. I just
Yeah,
don't think it's worth getting them out of bed if they're
I
running
agree.
less than that.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess, part of why I'm asking this question, and I'd be really curious, from an audience perspective, for those of you who are listening to the podcast, want to, send in your perspective or your answer. Scott Christensen, I'm looking at you. Um, what's the volume of those reps, right? Like if I'm only running 30 miles a week, right, I'm not going to do 2,000 meters of threshold in the morning and 3,000 meters of threshold in the afternoon. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But is it 4K and 6K? Is it, what does that volume look like? And how does that play into what our total mileage is over the course of a week? I think I agree with you. I think I would go a little bit lower. I think like 50 miles a week, you could make the argument for doing some type of double threshold work. I have kids who are running 50 miles a week and we might do 7K ish, 6 to 7K of threshold work. And, maybe I can see a world where we would do 5 or 6 in one session and 2 or 3 in the other. But then again, I'm not a science person. I would wonder like how beneficial is that extra 2 or 3? Are we talking like you've got to do 4K of at least 4K of threshold before we for one session before we start looking into a second one? I don't know what that answer is, but I'd be curious to hear what other people think.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting question because I bounced that off of several people. Is what is the minimal amount of threshold work a high schooler kid is going to benefit from? So, like,
Right.
if they're getting a morning run in, is it worth having them run, 3 minutes worth of a threshold effort at the end of their 30-minute run just to say that we're double thresholding, right? Like, what's the
Okay.
minimal amount of work? And we've talked about this in the past. I'm a firm believer that the first couple reps of threshold
Yeah,
are
it's
not
just
actually threshold.
going to bring that up.
So what's the minimal amount of volume? Because if we look at why we do double thresholds to get more stimulus. So let's say, for example, Jakob is going to be doing 15K worth of threshold work in his workout. He is not splitting that into 7.5 and 7.5 worth of work. He's trying
Right.
to get maybe 8 to 10 in one and then come back and try to get 8 to 10 in the other. Now, for those of you who read his training plans, that's not exactly what he does. That's not what we're trying to get at here. But the idea is you're going to be able to cram a little bit more. You're not trying to split what you would do in one session, which brings up the question you have, or that we have. When you do a single threshold effort for your kids, you're probably anywhere from 6 to 10K worth of work, right?
Yep.
So then what's that maximum volume if you're going to put it in two?
Right.
Are you going to try to get to 15K worth of work, or is that not enough when you split it up, right?
Right. And then does that become too much? For us, like we have I haven't been doing this as long, right? 11 years, but really writing workouts for 4, maybe 5 years. We had one day where we did 10K work of threshold work, and it was awful. Our
Yeah.
kids were just totally zapped. And interestingly enough, the week before we did 8K and they were feeling like $1,000,000. And there's a lot of different things that are going on, but it was wild to me the amount of kids who were like, that sucked. That was not what it has been in the past. It wasn't what you said it should feel like. Like we felt like we were working really, really hard. So when I think of like that volume, that for me has prevented me from really going down this path of double threshold, because if my kids are struggling at 10K, and some of it, we're not a huge volume program, maybe some of that it would be preventative from us doing it, is like if we're going to try to do 4 in the morning, 6 in the afternoon, or whatever that number might be, are they going to really struggle more than they should from that? And that's something we obviously don't want from a workout like that. So a lot to think about.
And here's the other thing. I've talked to a few coaches, and they said I threw it in one cycle and had very similar results to you, and thought I'm just trashing the rest of it. It's not worth it. But at what point do you say, all right, we need to give this a shot for X amount of weeks before we know if it's going to work or not, right? Because for your kids, it was terrible because they've never done it. Well, if you take somebody off the couch and you put them on a 3 mile run and they've never run 3 miles in their
Yeah.
life, they're going to hate it too.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot to unpack there. So I've got a very good friend who is going to give this a shot with some of his athletes. But what he's required out of them is that they are 7 seasoned healthy athletes, which means that they're going into their senior track season. They have had no injuries. He sat down with them. He's outlined how much sleep they need to have, all of these things. He only has a couple that are going to give it a shot. So I'm interested. But I think if you are a person who is wanting to dive into this, I tell you that to tell you this. You need to make sure that your athletes that you're going to put this through understand the physical and mental demands it's going to take for them given their schedules, especially during the school year.
Right. And I would guess that the first 6 weeks of it is going to be challenging, and you're not going to feel good over the majority, even though it's just threshold work. It's a completely new stimulus, a longer stimulus than what we're used to. I would imagine that like those kids, they're going to struggle, and being comfortable with the idea of going through that, knowing that there's going to be a long-term output that, in theory should allow them to do things that they probably couldn't have done before.
Yeah, I think that if you have a student athlete who is willing to take on those responsibilities, I think early in the season, give it a shot and see what happens. But let's be perfectly clear. I don't know, even with my own son, I don't know that I have anybody who would be willing to take on those responsibilities.
Sure.
Obviously, we are a smaller team, but um, man alive, uh, the reward could be very great, but the risk could be catastrophic.
Right. Let me ask you this, and obviously, you don't have to share who this is, but when they're writing their training plan, is it morning and afternoon? Is it going to be afternoon, go to bed, do it in the morning? Like, what's their thought process around how they're going to actually implement it?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is going to be evening and then back into the morning because with the sleep in there, they're going to be able to recover more than a morning afternoon session, which honestly, I think getting going, and we've talked, I think that's really smart on his part. They may
Yeah,
not be fully recovered, but it really lets you, if they're getting to sleep like they are supposed to, that recovery is going to be a lot better than just trying to do it through the course of the day when they're in school.
right. Yeah, I would agree. And I think if I was going to implement something like that, that would be the process I would go through is allowing the kids to get a full night of sleep before we jump back into it.
So let's go forward again. So you're prepping your kid for college. What are you going to do to start? Get them prepared. Even if you're not going to double threshold them, how can you prepare them physically for that stimulus?
Yeah.
And maybe it is getting, and we've talked about this together. Um, is the volume the precursor? Is the number of runs per week the precursor? I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. It's so funny you asked that, Jason, because I feel like I talked about this with people at the Boulder Running Clinic, uh, like on a number of occasions. It was almost odd the amount of people who were bringing that up. We are not a high volume program, um, but I've had kids who have gone into collegiate programs that are high volume, right? So I had a boy um, a couple years ago who is now running at the University of Oregon, and I knew, going into the University of Oregon, Jerry Schumacher, like he's a high volume guy. So I needed my kid to prepare for that so that he didn't go into that program and be like, oh my gosh, I'm used to running 50 miles a week and now I'm running 100. And that's not to say that we are going to get him up super, super high. But he was running, between 60 and 70 miles a week, which for us is pretty high, consistently with the idea that he's doing this in preparation for what he was going to do at the University of Oregon. And we would implement, some long runs in preparation for what he was going to do at Oregon. When I say longer, 14, which I think is long for a
Yep.
high school kid.
Yep.
But now, I chat with him and he's running 20, his freshman year, he's running 20, 21 miles for his long run. We weren't going to touch that, but at least it gives an idea of like what that extended period of time on feet is going to look like. So, if I'm looking and we're talking about double threshold, so I don't want to get totally off track of that. But when I'm looking at preparation for college, it's not so much workouts, I think, that I'm trying to prepare them for. It's a couple things. It's one is volume, right? Like getting them up a little bit more based on what their program is or that coach is known for. Um, Two is recognition that their current experience won't be their future experience. And we've had kids, and I know I'm going off on a tangent, but I actually think this is really helpful. I tell kids all the time, like when you go to your, whatever college you're going to go to, like you have to give that person a chance. You have a current relationship with your coaches, me, whoever. That's excellent. That was not the case as a freshman. And a lot of kids, I think, go to college expecting that same relationship to pick up like that right away. And that doesn't happen. And then they really struggle. So I think, that's a big piece that I'm trying to remind them of like, it's not going to be the same. And that's not a bad thing, but you have to give that next person the same level of respect, that same level of wanting to get to know them and build that relationship that you did with me. And those are really the two things that I try to focus on the most. So I know I went off on a tangent, but I think that those are helpful things, or at least what's been helpful for us. And, we've been blessed that our kids run really fast in high school and they run even faster in college. And that makes me really, really proud.
Yeah, and I think that, but that's so pertinent because you're willing to make that adjustment because you figure out how you can do it within the guidelines of your program. And I think that's the most important thing. Like that's the art of what we're doing, right? It's not getting stuck on, it doesn't matter where you're going. This is how we're doing things while you're here, right? It's
Right.
looking at the big picture of that student athlete. You're not looking just physically at that student athlete. You're looking mentally at that student athlete because if you can adapt them just a little bit to where they're going, their experience is going to be better when they get there.
Right.
Right. If you take your athlete that ran at Oregon or runs at Oregon currently, and they're only doing 10 to 12 with you, and then they jump to a 20-mile run, they're spending twice as much time on their feet.
Right.
Like that's insane to think about how a positive transition would go.
Yes. Yeah. And it's, and I've kept in touch with him, and we've talked about that
Yeah.
of how that's helped him. Because you do get that with college coaches, right? Like this is my plan. This is the way that I train, and this is the way that we're going to do it. And there's not as much, specialization amongst kids. We had a kid who, a couple of years ago, he ran 347 for 1500. He was a top 10 kid in the country. And he ran 50 miles a week, but he made up for a lot of that lack of volume with doing a lot of cross training stuff. And he's at a program now that doesn't necessarily believe in that. And that's been a hard transition for him, coming from like this idea of I can run and do these other things to help me prepare to run fast versus like, no, I just have to run every day and there's no other option. So I think it's being flexible and recognizing like what works for this kid. And then, at the next level, like what are they going to have to get ready for? And we try to be, mindful of that.
So if you're blind to this and you don't know what double threshold is and you think that we're crazy talking about this, I think one of the things you can think about is, can not squeeze is the wrong word, but can I get a little bit more volume in here and there to help that athlete? If you know where they're going and they're going on somewhere who potentially is going to be double threshold, could I potentially increase the number of runs? Maybe you're just going to pick up 2 morning runs that they're not used to, an easy 30 minutes, 20, 30 minutes, right? Get that
Right.
extra time on their feet. What can you do in preparation? Maybe with your program, maybe it's spending a little more time in the weight room. Maybe it's doing a little more ancillary work after they get done running, prescribing just a little more stimulus, because all we're trying to do is get them to be able to adapt faster. If their college coach is going to send them 100 miles a week and they're strong enough, I hate to use not hate to, but Jay's great analogy of is the chassis strong enough, right? Put them in the weight room, right? You
Right.
don't want to run any more volume, put them in the weight room, get their frame strong enough so they can hold it when they move on.
Right.
Simple things like that potentially help set a kid up for success as they move forward. It also potentially gives you the ability to think, hey, you know what? This really worked well for a kid. Maybe as my kids get older, I want to start to include these things, help them run faster when they're with me, not just with me, but when they get older as well.
Right.
Some huge positives there. All right, so we look at double threshold. It can be done in a variety of different ways, right? One of the primary things you got to keep in mind is maybe stray away from the norm and think just maybe the 1 or 2 things that you could do. It may not be double threshold at all, but maybe the 1 or 2 things that you could do in your program to set you up for success to help them run a little bit faster.
Yeah.
Right. Weight room. Maybe you're bad about getting strides in with your team. Strides be a great way to add just a little bit more volume.
Right.
Maybe you're gonna add 5 minutes onto their warm up. Right. That's sneaky volume. Instead of them going out the door and doing a mile, maybe they're doing a 2-mile warm up.
Right.
Simple things.
That's a big part of what we do. I think strides are great. For your kids who are brand new and don't really run very much, like it's an easy way. You do 4 to 8 strides. It's an easy way to get, an extra half mile. And if this kid's only running 2 miles for their training run, like you're looking at, 25% of what they're doing, or adding 25% to what they're doing. I think is a great way. Yeah. So, to your point, I think you're spot on, right? Like, double threshold in theory is an awesome thing. Maybe maybe it's not the right thing for high school kids, but there's other ways that we can get some of these stimuluses in to help us to run at a higher level. It doesn't have to be a double threshold. To your point, it can be getting in the weight room, it could be strides, it can be some of this other stuff. But I think really taking a look within your program and seeing, where do I have some things that I can add within my day, and what or how do I want to add that?
Awesome stuff. All right. So we are moving into track season for both of us. Eric, hopefully defrost by the time they get out there. No skating on your track.
Yeah.
I saw that.
Yeah.
In another month, we'll be in season. Hopefully, we'll examine a little bit more training, maybe starting the racing season, how that's going to look like for you. We have an indoor season. If your kids are doing indoor, they're on their own, correct?
Yeah, we race unattached essentially indoor. So we'll go up to University of Washington for a meet. We have some kids who are going to Spokane with the new indoor facility they have up there. We'll take a small group to Nike indoors, but everything's unattached, similar to like when we go to NXR. We're not racing for Lincoln High School. We're racing for our club team.
So maybe we can talk about how we're going to start that period instead of just firing the cannon and shooting them out and see what happens, right? So as we get into next month, if you've got questions, ideas, let us know. I want to conclude with this: go to Boulder Running Clinics if you don't go. Right, we were 250 strong this year, and it was awesome. I think Jay sold out. A couple people had to bail or couldn't show at the last minute, but really close to sold out. It was such a great environment to be around. Okay.
Yeah.
Second thing is make sure that you have water in your house so you don't end up looking like this guy at the end. All right.
Yeah. I would say yes to both of those. But I'll make another plug for Boulder. The clinics are awesome, and listening to, Justin Leonard at South Lake Carroll, who's had a ton of success, and Marie and Robin, Marie being my assistant, with Wildwood and talking about supporting female runners, and so on and so forth. Shannon Thompson, the psychologist at NAU, those sessions are incredible. And there's so much that we can pull from those. But to what I said earlier, Jay does this amazing job of creating this culture of after, the socials, the happy hours, the whatever, 1 o'clock in the morning. And I'm sitting there chatting. Well, probably not 1 o'clock because Alex doesn't like to stay up that late, but Alex Lyons and I are chatting at a bar about, what I did differently in the fall this year. And he's giving me criticism on some of the things that I did and going back and forth. Like those are the experiences that I think are so special about that clinic as well. That are just so special. And, you learn a lot, you make some amazing friends, it's where you and I first met. The amount of people that and I know of others who've gotten phone numbers at that clinic who continue to keep in touch, continue to keep in contact. Like there's not a better environment out there. I think I would highly encourage everyone to do that.
Yeah. And my last plug, this is not for Boulder, but I just on the airplane ride, I was listening to some Just Athletics podcasts, and those guys do a great job out there. And so I highly recommend that you listen to them as well because they do a phenomenal job. Those three young men who are great friends of ours.
Yes. Yeah, I love that podcast as well.
That was the high road, just so anybody out there knows. All right. All right. Well, have a great month, and hopefully we hear from you. Give us some ideas. If we screwed up double threshold, let us know. We're learning along the way. Talking to people is great. Knowing the science is even better, but we're both not exact science guys. We know enough outline to get you there, but if we screwed up, let us know. Look forward to seeing you again in a month. Share this with anybody you got. Subscribe, do all that fun stuff. So
Awesome. Thank
until
you.
next time.